U.S. President Joe Biden and Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky signed a 10-year bilateral security agreement on Thursday aimed at bolstering Ukraine's defense against Russian invaders. The deal, signed on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Italy, aims to commit future U.S. administrations to support Ukraine, even if former President Donald Trump wins November's election, officials said.
Our goal is to strengthen Ukraine's credible defense and deterrence capabilities for the long term. A lasting peace for Ukraine must be underwritten by Ukraine's own ability to defend itself now and to deter future aggression anytime in the future. The United States is going to help ensure that Ukraine can do both.
This is an agreement on steps to guarantee sustainable peace, and therefore it benefits everyone in the world, because the Russian war against Ukraine is a real global threat.
The agreement indicates the U.S. will provide weapons and ammunition and intelligence sharing, and is meant to be a step toward Ukraine's eventual NATO membership. Zelensky has long sought this, but allies have stopped short of taking that step. Also Thursday, G7 leaders agreed in principle on plans to issue $50 billion of loans for Ukraine, backed by interest from Russian sovereign assets frozen after Moscow launched its invasion of its neighbor in 2022. This comes one day after the U.S. dramatically broadened sanctions on Russia, including by targeting China-based companies selling semiconductors to Moscow, as part of its effort to undercut the Russian military machine waging war on Ukraine. Trump has expressed skepticism of Ukraine's continued fight, saying at one point that he would end the conflict on his first day in office. He met with lawmakers in Washington Thursday who said he criticized a $60 billion aid package for Ukraine that recently passed with Republican support.
Both leaders will now sign an historic new bilateral security agreement between the United States and Ukraine.
The historic peace conference happening in Switzerland this weekend, where Vice President Harris will run a joint declaration of support for Ukraine. 25 additional countries joined us quickly. President Zelensky and I have just now signed that agreement between the United States and Ukraine. Our goal is to strengthen Ukraine's credible defense and deterrence capabilities for the long term. A lasting peace for Ukraine must be underwritten by Ukraine's own ability to defend itself now and to deter future aggression anytime in the future. The United States is going to help ensure that Ukraine can do both, not by sending American troops to fight in Ukraine, but by providing weapons and ammunition, expanding intelligence sharing, continuing to train brave Ukrainian troops at bases in Europe and the United States, enhancing interoperability between our militaries in line with NATO standards, investing in Ukraine's defense industrial base, so in time, they can supply their own weapons and munitions, working with Ukraine's partners to build a future force that is strong, sustainable, and resilient, and supporting Ukraine's economic recovery, as well as its energy recovery, after Russia has repeatedly targeted Ukraine's energy grid with massive attacks in the futile attempt to break the will of the Ukrainian people. Outside of Russia. Additionally, the G7 achieved a significant outcome this week on the matter of Russia's frozen assets in Europe and other places outside of Russia. Back in 2022, 2 days after Russia's invasion, members of the G7 and the European Union worked together to freeze $280 billion in Russian central bank funds outside of Russia. I'm very pleased to share that this week, the G7 signed a plan to finalize and unlock $50 billion from the proceeds of those frozen assets to put that money to work for Ukraine. Another reminder to Putin, we're not backing down. In fact, we're standing together against this illegal aggression. Ukraine's partners to build a future for us that is strong. The agreement that President Zelensky and I just signed also lays out our shared vision for a just peace, a peace rooted in the UN Charter and the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, a peace with a broad base of support around the world that holds Russia accountable for the damage it has done in this war. We will see this vision strongly affirmed at the historic peace conference happening in Switzerland this weekend, where Vice President Harris will represent the United States. Finally, this agreement accelerates Ukraine's integration into the European and transatlantic communities. It includes major commitments from Ukraine to implement democratic, economic, and security reforms in line with the European Union's accession goals, sustainable and resilient, and supporting Ukraine's economic. Plus, at the G7, we discussed our shared concern about countries like China, who are supplying Russia with materials they need for their war machine. And we agreed to taking collective action to push back against that activity. Let me close with this. We've taken 3 major steps at the G7 that collectively show Putin we cannot wait us out. He cannot divide us. And we'll be with Ukraine until they prevail in this war. First is the bilateral security agreement just signed. Second, historic agreement to provide $50 billion in value from Russian sovereign assets to Ukraine. And third, an agreement to ensure our sanctions efforts disrupt third countries that are supplying Russia's war efforts. That will increase pressure on the Russian economy. Collectively, this is a powerful set of actions and will create a stronger foundation for Ukraine's success. We affirmed at the historic peace conference happening in Switzerland this weekend for Vice President Harris. While we take this step, the United States is also intensifying pressure on Russia. Yesterday, the U.S. Treasury Department made clear any bank anywhere in the world that deals with sanctioned Russian banks, companies, or individuals risk being sanctioned themselves. Harris will represent the United States. Finally, this agreement. Putin is counting on revenues from these projects. Our sanctions will disrupt those plans. Plus, at the G7, we discussed our shared concern about countries like China, who are supplying Russia with materials they need for their war machine. And we agreed to taking collective action to push back against that activity.
I have a question for President Zelensky shortly on the announcement.
And so we're going to stay as long as it takes. With regard to the plan, that is a plan in process now. We're discussing with our Ukrainian friends exactly what it would be. We have a lot of movement toward that. We know the outlines of it. We have not done the detail of it all. But we know what Ukraine is capable of doing when given the material to defend themselves, and that's exactly what they're doing now.
Thank you about your discussions on the situation in Gaza here at the summit.
But the bottom line is that we've made an agreement. I've laid out an approach that has been endorsed by the UN Security Council, by the G7, by the Israelis, and the biggest hang-up so far is Hamas refusing to sign on, even though they have submitted something similar. Whether or not it comes to fruition remains to be seen. We're going to continue to push. I don't have a final answer for you. Yesterday, the U.S. Treasury Department made clear any